I'll just introduce our speakers and then we'll get started. First, we're going to hear from Francis McKee, who's an Irish curator and writer living in Glasgow, and he's also the director of the Centre for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow. Then we're going to hear from Shawn Micallef, who's the senior editor of Spacing magazine and co-founder of the Murmur mobile phone documentary project, which some of you may know. And Maarten Hajer is the director of the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, as well as professor of political science and public policy at the University of Amsterdam. So I'd now like to welcome Francis McKee to the stage to give his presentation. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Oh, hi, I'm going first because I've got the flu and I might fall over at some point during this, so I'm hoping I don't. I got some slides as well, and I'm excusing myself from the intellectual climax a little because I'm not sure I'm going to climax. Let's see, first slide. I'm really going to talk about 3 different cities. And I've just been reading a nice science fiction book, The City and the City by China Miéville. I don't know if anyone's read it yet. It's a very nice book. It's going to be one of those classics like Invisible Cities. It's about 2 cities that inhabit the same space at the same time. And if you live in one city, you can't see the other city. You have to learn to unsee it. It's there, but you aren't allowed to see it, so you have to unsee it. And that goes for the inhabitants of the other city as well. There are certain cross-hatched areas in the city which you can stand in, but if you stand in them, you're then in breach, and you're taken away and you're never seen again. And this seemed reasonably pertinent to me. It's meant to be based on cities like Berlin or Nicosia or various places in the Balkans. But it also reminded me a lot of Jerusalem, which I'd just been to. And really there are 2 different cultures inhabiting the same space with the same history, but with different versions of that history and different versions of each street. And as you go down each street, you either see one or you see the other. And you learn to unsee one culture or the other, and you're sometimes forced to do that. So I thought it was a kind of nice metaphor, really, for something like this. And I've spent a lot of time, both Palestine, Mexico, Glasgow, which is a strange triangle. But in Palestine, I was kind of fascinated with that moment where cities are trying to reshape themselves. They're being reshaped by very strange sets of forces. And I'm not here to sort of get into the politics of it all today, but the forces are incredible and quite dramatic that are shaping how the cities are formed or reformed or rebuilt or unbuilt, and how people try and inhabit those cities. And really, something like the wall, for instance, is one of the most obvious versions of that, where the city is being divided and the country is being divided, but not necessarily with people on one side and people on the other. It's actually cleaving communities through the middle and placing some people on one side, sometimes their business on the other, and people are having to readapt around that. They're having to find holes. They're having to find a kind of porosity between the 2 states from both sides, actually, to make things work. And see if I can do this to move on. The other thing that's happening at the same time are settlements, and really I'm basing some of this on A.L. Weisman's Hollow Land, but the notion that architecture and cities have become really the main form of occupation within a country and the real main form of political activity through building. So you get settlements like this, which are just a few hundred yards outside of Ramallah, for instance, 2 different settlements which gradually are joining up. And what you see is the joining up of different settlements and different architecture, which just creates a new state of fact on the ground and a new city on the ground, which completely then takes away the culture of the other, and you have 2 populations looking at each other, one population wondering what's going to happen now this other city has arrived. And these cities are almost invisible in the way that they arrive. They're almost unnamed. The things that are happening are never discussed. So you find people are talking about 1,500 houses in Jerusalem at the moment, when there's something like 50,000 being built across the rest of the area. So the way this is happening is a form of occupation and a form of military activity through architecture. Weisman goes on to talk about how this goes into very strange, surreal areas where actually Israeli generals are studying French structuralist theory in order to find new tactics for how to deal with, for instance, the siege of a city, so that they will look at how the inside can be the outside and the outside can be the inside. They will look at Deleuze and Guattari to formulate new ways of actually attacking a city or approaching a city or reconceiving what a city is and how you can approach it as a soldier. And this actually has strange effects on the rebuilding of cities. This is Jenin, where there was a massacre a few years ago. It's one of the refugee camps in the north. One of the few places that was allowed to be rebuilt, but it was allowed to be rebuilt by the Israelis only if the streets were wide enough for tanks to be able to go down. So they measured their tanks and built the streets accordingly in collaboration with the Palestinians to allow this to happen. So it's kind of weird way in which your city exists with wide enough streets for reoccupation. At the same time, in places like Ramallah, there's a constant building and rebuilding going on. The city changes constantly, and this is not necessarily some kind of response just to the political necessities or in a very direct way. It's not some explicit thing like tanks and streets. It's a sort of redefinition that's in constant motion of the city. Sometimes it's been rebuilt completely as a sort of strange, surreal consumer paradise. Lots of supermarkets, lots of hotels are being built that are all completely empty, but they're being built with a view to something might change, so these things will be there. Then they've been taken away again, and other things are being built. And the building is a constant process of building, ripping down, building again, with these vast, impressive foundations as well. And it's also a city that is kind of stark contrast. It has all of the kind of modern signage, it has all of the modern kind of display that we find in contemporary cities. And at the same time, it has incredibly traditional crafts sitting side by side with this. But what's interesting at the moment is how they're defining what a city should be. And again, they're going to French theory. And if you look at someone like Paul Virilio in Lost Dimensions, he talks about the city of Paris in that book and says there is the city of Paris you can go to. It's a concrete city. It has gates. And you can enter the gates, the old gates from the Middle Ages or from the 18th century, and you know where the threshold of the city is, and you can enter and go to the center of the city. That's a very established geography. But Virilio argues that, in fact, it's an outdated geography, and the real city of Paris exists in 12 computers that can be in any basement anywhere in the city, or can actually be moved to Lyon or Marseille or to London. The city of Paris really exists in those machines, not in the fabric of the real old concrete city. And that seems like a nice, impressive French theory, but the Palestinians have actually taken this up and have begun to look at how they can build archives and are now doing a whole series of electronic archives for contemporary art, for architecture, for music, for treasures, for culture, for religion. And what they've decided is that if they create these archives, they don't have to have concrete established buildings, they don't have to have concrete locations. However, the establishment of the archive, even in a virtual state, makes it more difficult for them to disappear as a literal political state. The establishment of the archives gives them a credibility and a sort of realness that makes it hard for them to be wiped out, for them to be overly occupied. And so they've almost moved to the virtual arena in order to establish a presence that will continue to define what it is in their culture that can be protected. And so it's kind of a strange move, but it's a move in which they're playing constantly with what it means to be a city, where it can be located. And through all the refugee camps, they're incredibly wired up as well. So there is a great network running through the camps, digital networks to establish them as well. So there's a kind of virtual Palestine that's almost emerging as a reaction in some kind of, in a way, as a playful reaction in funny ways too. This is probably what I mean in this. This is Stars and Bucks Cafe, which is a perfect replica of Starbucks in the center of Ramallah. If you go in, it mimics everything in Starbucks. It's exact. It's better, but it's exact. And it's called Stars and Bucks because Starbucks would not turn up there. There's also an Acosta Cafe, which is an exact Costa Cafe, but you can also get bubble pipes and things in it as well. But it is an entire replica. What they're doing really is bootlegging corporate franchises and setting them up across the city because those corporate franchises, they want them, but they won't come. So they're actually just ripping them off and bootlegging them and producing them themselves. And they know it's a kind of an in-joke, but they love this and they love the pleasure of going in. And it's actually better than going to the real place when you go in and you know it's not real, but it's an exact replica. And it's a fascinating thing. They all also happen at least one story up for some reason. I don't know why. And there's this one as well, Pink Mink Women, which is basically just a very nice, trendy clothes shop for women. But the title is what's important, that all of the titles of all of the shops across Ramallah, things like Delicious Shoes, for instance, one of my favorite. And there's another one that used to be called Bata Shoes. It was taken over by someone else, and they renamed it Bata than the one that was here before. And it's a kind of playfulness and a punning with language that completely adept with English, for instance, always in English. But also it's a kind of playfulness with what a city can be, because they're not really allowed to have one in a proper sense. So they're making up one that's a kind of a playful replica of all the things they see and would like to have and can mess around with. So there's a sort of messiness to it and sort of bootlegging tendency to it, which I kind of admire in a way. It's just more Janine. This is Mexico City. This looks quite severe, especially I haven't talked about Ramallah. And it is in a way. 2 Christmases ago, these soldiers, police, lined every street in the city centre, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them in every street. What they're doing is stopping stalls from setting up. All across the centre of Mexico City, there are hundreds of stalls. And the stalls sell bootleg albums, bootleg books. They even sell covers for bootlegs. You can go to one stall and buy a cover for a bootleg. You can go to a next stall and buy the bootleg itself and then put the two together. It's an incredibly sophisticated operation that spreads across a city of 23 million people. This is just beside an area called Tepito. Tepito is an area where all of the bootlegging happens, vast warehouses where people are committed on an industrial level to creating bootlegs of everything. It goes through toys, it goes through everything you could possibly want to buy. You can buy it on the street in a bootleg form, very high quality and perfect replica. Tepito is such a notorious place. Even the army can't easily get in. The police certainly can't get in. The army have to have several regiments. There are famous films of regiments sort of being drafted in, running down the streets, trying to take a warehouse because it's so dangerous and it's so impregnable, really, and it's such a labyrinth of stalls. It's impossible for anyone to find their way around. But in the center of this kind of unapproachable labyrinth, this bootleg industry thrives and then spreads across the city. The council is trying to clear it up in the city centre because they want to regenerate and gentrify the city centre. And so these men stand there all day, every day, trying to stop the stalls from setting up. They've succeeded now, so the stalls are no longer there, but it took several months of this happening on a daily basis for that to happen. What has happened instead is the stalls have returned but inserted themselves into the cracks in the city. So if they're not in the front, if there's a doorway, the stall will find itself in the doorway and recessed from the street. And it's almost like, it's like cockroaches in a way. They find another way in and they find another way to sort of set up. And they keep operating and they keep finding new places within the old locations. And they're impossible to sort of get rid of. And they just keep working this. And those new stalls are all there and they can't be moved at this point. Other places in Mexico City that sort of work like this are giant squats. This is what we'll call Chanti Olin, which again, army and police keep raiding it, trying to close it down, taking people away, arresting them, just putting them in prison. But it's for a sort of an underground culture, really anarchist culture, that operates from these kind of various places. These all connect with things like the Zapatista movement as well, which are all scattered across the city. But what they become are a whole variety of impregnable areas across Mexico City that can't be touched, that are hard to get into, in which an alternative economy and an alternative society operates. And what interests me is that in both Ramallah and Mexico, there are the mainstream economies elsewhere that these people aren't able to approach and at certain levels don't want to approach. And they've set up these alternatives which mimic in some ways, but also offer alternative ways of working. Again, these are all highly networked, and the Zapatistas are famously highly networked across Mexico and the world. It's another way of protecting yourself, like in Ramallah. If you're highly networked, you're visible, you're present. So if you're attacked, you can't easily disappear. This is Glasgow. Not really the same. But what I was interested in those other cities is that kind of, I guess what Hakeem Bey calls the temporary autonomous zone, which seems to be one of the areas in which cities can now find ways in which to operate beyond the mainstream. And the mainstream is so all-encompassing and so deadening in a sense when it's really effective. That you need something like that if you're going to have a living culture. And I'm using Glasgow in the opposite sense, in that Glasgow did have a major industry until about 1985. The shipbuilding, steel, everything vanished completely by about 1985. And the city was in trauma after that and didn't really know what to do about it. They had a vast museum and archive of the city, but they put it away. They wouldn't even display it in the museums because they felt and said publicly it was too traumatic for the people of Glasgow to look at that history because it had vanished so recently and the wounds are so raw and there was so much unemployment. So it was put away for good, at least at the time. Now they're trying to regenerate the river, but the regeneration is done with complete complicity from the city. And the city is incredibly patriarchal and incredibly all-encompassing. It's very sophisticated in that it understands that art and culture are good for a city in the Richard Florida sense of a creative city. And a creative city will sort of attract new jobs. It will attract new middle-class young professionals who want to live in those areas. And they have become so adept at that they use it constantly in a very sophisticated way to attract and regenerate the city. The problem is that they are so adept that almost nothing new can happen without them immediately sensing it and validating it. And as soon as they validate it, they kind of kill it. So this is the problem with Glasgow, in that it's so adept at regeneration, so adept at the notion of a creative city, that actually what it's creating is a brand in which culture cannot really live or thrive for very long before it's branded and repackaged to be exported. And I think the city is perfect for that. There's only one bit of life really on the river at the moment, and that's these rowers who go out at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturdays. And the two men in the boat behind, who are called the Glasgow Humane Society, who are kind of fascinating, they only exist to save, well, not to save people if they can, if they throw themselves in the river, but they know where the bodies will come up later. If you commit suicide, where you'll turn up down the Clyde in 3 days' time. That's their function. But they're the only people who really have any true response to the city anymore. Everywhere else, the city has been regenerated with these ziggurats down the sides. They've all been built to last 20 years, but none of them really connect to the city itself. They all exist alongside the city, but the river itself is only a backdrop, which is very low down and you can't get any access to the river. So the river itself has been excluded from the regeneration of the river. And that's a new Zaha Hadid building, which is going to house a new museum of transport, which will talk about shipbuilding and the history of Glasgow, but again with no access to the river. It's near the river, it's beside the river, but ignores the river. And even there's one shipyard left, but the developers have this kind of very strange blindness to it and build right beside it, but in a way that doesn't even take any kind of account of it. And the river runs out quite quickly and ends up in sort of a disaster zone again, where in a sense it's not really development or regeneration as much as displacement. And in all of these three cities I'm talking about, there is a sense of displacement and people's being displaced rather than regenerated, and culture trying to respond to that. And each of them is a different sense of trauma that is trying, populations are trying to deal with it, often in a very playful way, and ironically in a more playful way in both Mexico City and Ramallah than in Glasgow, where everything is so condoned and so validated and so official, because the city is so sophisticated at this. There is a deadening effect to that, I think. I'm on a little amber light here, so I'm going to stop and just hand over to the next speaker. So thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Francis. And now we're going to welcome Shawn Micallef to the stage, who has promised us a very funny presentation. So it better be funny, Shawn.
I didn't say that. Hi, Shawn Micallef. I'm from Toronto, and I'm going to talk about a few projects that we do in Toronto. And I'm particularly excited to talk about it here in Manchester. I'm going to talk about how Toronto has trouble with its mythology, and basically how we don't tell stories very well in Toronto. And a city like Manchester has no trouble at all. Growing up in Windsor, Ontario, near Toronto, near the Detroit border, Manchester sort of loomed big on the cultural horizon somewhere. A little bit had to do with the history of the city, part of the British Empire. This was the industrial powerhouse of the British Empire. But also in the 90s and into the 2000s and before my time in the 80s, the music and cultural scene of Manchester was massive, way bigger than a city this size probably should have. In Detroit, the techno scene was found here, discovered here in North England. The first place I went yesterday when I got here and put my bag at the hotel was to find the old Hacienda location, which is now a condominium. But this was sort of like the mythological ground zero of the idea of Manchester. And the way Manchester's been able to export the idea of itself across the ocean to little provincial towns where I grew up is quite amazing. Toronto, on the other hand, we have 2.5 million people in the city, 5 million people in the metro area, and it perpetually thinks nothing important happens in our city. The citizens, we have this kind of condition of looking elsewhere for culture, looking elsewhere for important things that happen. One of the, I figure, the causes of this is that we are a colonial city. Everything in Toronto is named after something around here. I noticed a few streets away from the hotel, there's Sackville Street. In Toronto, I live on Sackville Street. I don't live on Toronto Street, I live on Sackville Street. There's statues of King George, Queen Victoria everywhere. The Queen is on our money. There's all these physical references around town that take us out of the local and throw us back to the mother country, England, Scotland, all these references. We're sort of on the small country that exists on the top of 300 million people, Americans. We're sort of a de facto colony of American culture, whether we like it or not. And this has manifested itself in a number of ways. The Art Gallery of Ontario, the big, huge contemporary art gallery in Toronto that Frank Gehry just redid, until about 30 years ago, the chief curator always had to come from Britain. It wasn't right. A Canadian could not curate our collection. It had to come from the place where people know this sort of thing. Canadian literature didn't exist until about 30 years ago, the idea that we had our own canon. So all these things kind of happen a little bit forced. And right now in Toronto, there's a pretty good music scene. But I'm not really sure, I'm not convinced that the idea of a Toronto sound or Toronto music gets out the way Manchester did in the 80s with the Smiths and Joy Division and Manchester in the 90s. So it's interesting to compare these two cities. In Toronto, I'm going to talk about 3 projects that I have worked on that try and create a mythology of Toronto, help our mythology along in small ways. And the first is the Murmur Project, which I helped co-found about 7 years ago, in Toronto. What we do is we record people telling stories about specific geographic locations. The story can be about anything. I fell in love in this park bench. This was the apartment building that I lived in when we came from Cambodia in 1970. This is the building where I work. The stories can be small, great. It doesn't matter. As long as they are somehow attached to that place, then we put up a sign in that spot with a phone number and a location code. You call the number, a voice comes on and says, "Welcome to Murmur, what's the code?" And you plug in the code, our computer knows where you're standing, and it plays the stories for that spot. Usually 30 seconds to 2 minutes are the stories. We like to have more than one story at each location, so they start layering up. So one story doesn't start representing that place. And we started in Toronto in 2003, and we made these homemade signs that we put up in the dark of night. And there's nothing more conspicuous than standing on a ladder, fiddling with a pole in Toronto. We glued them on with really toxic smelling glue and got dizzy. It took about 3 months for us scouring the neighborhood, trying to get people to tell us stories about places, which was really difficult. When we had the concept of this project, we thought people would beat down our doors trying to, I got to tell my story. Finally, I can tell my story and let other people hear it. But in Toronto, it's like pulling teeth to get people to talk about themselves. So often the phrase when we say, "Can you talk about this place?" People will say, "Oh, my story's not important, you should talk to someone else." And I stopped using the word story. I stopped asking for stories because story intimidates people. So I say, "Can we have a conversation about your neighborhood, about this house, about this place?" And people we'll start talking back and forth. And the moment I say story, they kind of clam up. So I had to be sneaky about it to get these stories. But we got the stories, established 12 locations around town, around this neighborhood called Kensington Market, which is a sort of chaotic, tightly knit, punk, vintage store, new Canadian immigrants neighborhood, and put this project up. When we record people, we like to record people telling stories in the spot where it happened. Again, most of our storytellers are amateurs, people who say they don't tell stories, but we all do that. So if we bring them to the spot that the story takes place, their imaginations come alive a lot easier, and the details of the story are reminded. They'll remember that it was the orange window that they lived in, that they might not say otherwise. And it puts them at ease, because sticking a microphone in someone's face is a bit intimidating. So this is us recording a city councillor talking about his grandfather's vegetable store, which has since been torn down. So he was imagining the vegetable store there. We got a bigger budget for the next project, and we're able to change our signs, get a real sign designer to make these nice ear-shaped signs. So this is another sign in Toronto. One of the reasons we picked cell phones is because we had no money, and we didn't know how we were going to distribute this. This was the primitive days of 2003, when North America was a little bit behind the Europeans and the Japanese on adopting cell phones. Cell phones were still these clunky utilitarian tools. The idea of using it for a entertainment or a cultural device, we had to. It was at the cusp of that in 2003. Nobody texted, really, in 2003. I remember I came to the UK in that year, and I took the Piccadilly line from Heathrow into town, and all these people were looking down at their cell phones. I was like, why are they doing that? And they were all texting. It took me a while to figure that out, because we weren't doing that yet. Now we're okay, we text. The thing with cell phones, though, we didn't have to supply a device to people to listen. They supply their own, and it's sort of ubiquitous. But the best part is the technology disappears. We have a technological backend that makes this thing work, but the project is not about technology. When you're on the phone to somebody, you never think about how your voice gets digitized and goes to a cell tower and goes wherever it goes. It's just this really intimate connection between you and your mother or your lover or whoever it is you're talking to. So that's a sort of connection we really like with Murmur. You call the sign, it's that person talking directly to you. When we edit the stories, we take out the interviewer. So it's as if that person is kind of a ghost whispering in your ear a story. Where are we? Putting up the signs. We've since started putting up the signs in daylight. Nobody looks at you when you're up on a pole in the daylight, but they look at you at night. We are in about 9, 10, or 11 neighborhoods. This is our website in Toronto right now, and we've since spread to about 22 cities around the world. I'm not sure if we would have started Murmur in a different city because of that condition, that unmythologized condition I was talking about in Toronto that really inspired us to do this project. For each neighborhood that we do, we commission a local artist, which is my friend Marlena, to draw a hand-drawn map. And her maps, these physical things that are we hand out as postcards, they're also on the website, show where the stories are, but also it's like this kind of another layer of storytelling. Her illustrations are very rich with little details, if you can get up close to them. So each neighborhood has one of these maps. These maps actually became the selling point of the best PR thing we stumbled into. The signs are kind of subtle, but I would go to parties at people's houses and that I didn't really know and see these maps up on their fridge, which was sort of, which is neat because they are sort of these iconic, nice items. So I'll play a story now from a recent project we did last year in the Grange neighborhood, which is near the AGO. We have like 300 stories in Toronto, so I just randomly picked 2 to play here today.
My name is Pearl Kwong, and I work managing 90 units of nonprofit housing. The new building that we developed at 2 Murray Street, we call it Vance Latchford Place, but it was George Brown's Nightingale campus. The residential floors that we have were originally the nursing student residences. So if you go in the basement, you can find the tunnel that goes across the road to the hospitals that the nurses would take late at night because it was safer. It's kind of creepy looking now, but it was, the safe route home. They didn't have to go outside, and then they would just go up to their rooms. The rooms right now are the same size as the nurses had. Some of the common spaces have been reconfigured. It happens sometimes, like at work, old women will come by and they say, I used to go to school here and I had a room. Can I go see my room? And I'm like, well, if you want to see the building, you can see the building, but you can't go in the room because it's somebody else's room. It was nurses' residence, and now it's transitional housing.
So I really like the blend, when we can get it, of a bit of facts from people, but also their personal connection, why those facts matter. We could have we're very adamant that we're not a historical plaque type project. We don't fact check these stories. I assume they're all true, but also I don't care. When we tell stories that we think are true, we always tell them different the second time or the third time. We leave a detail out or we bring it in. So there's a bit of fuzziness there. And mythologies of cities aren't always made on the truth. You're getting a quarter of the experience here. When you're there, you can actually look at the building that she's talking about and walk around it. And some of our storytellers tell people to walk around the building, look at this tree, put your finger in the bullet hole, that sort of thing. This is the Annex neighborhood that we did in 2004, and I'll play another story on the corner of Bloor and Spadina here.
I got a man arrested at Scotiabank on the corner of Bloor and Spadina. I'd only moved here a few weeks earlier. This was last spring. And basically what had happened is I was walking up the street, and there's usually a bunch of guys that like to sell drugs in the corner where Pizza is. And normally I just ignore that like everyone else, but this particular day, they were quite drunk, or at least one of them was, this guy who had no shirt on, even though it was really cold and rainy, and a pair of sweats that weren't quite snug enough, and basically he was exposed. And what he was doing was just simply running up and yelling to people and standing in front of women and, confronting them and trying to make them get out of his way. And it occurred to me that this was probably not the best behavior that Toronto has. So I called the police, and what happened was I called them and they said, okay, what's your name? And I said my name, and I also mentioned they're dealing drugs, although I never really could see it, but I just guessed. And within a few minutes, cops arrive, and I'm watching from my window, and it was way better than TV. They go around the corner where I can't see, and then they come back out, and they have this guy in cuffs and like a big bag of drugs that they put on the hood of their car. And they take him away, and I never see him again. And I'm not sure how I feel about what I did, but I did do it. My name is Mike.
So I really like this story because it doesn't have a nice resolution. It's left. He doesn't know if he did the right thing or not. But there it is, he did it. And this was my neighborhood at the time, and I walked by that Scotiabank every day. And since I recorded that story always pops up as I walk by that place. It's almost like it's my story. Once you hear a story intimately told, it's sort of like a pushpin on the map, and it's a bit of you in there. It almost belongs to you, even though it's not my story. You could tell in the middle the audio changed a bit, and because we do it in situ, a truck went by or something, so we had to move to an alley, and that changed the acoustics a bit. So my hope is that when we start layering these stories on these blank, what are in our minds are these blank places on our mental map of Toronto, they start to live on that map and kind of be fleshed out and gooey. I hope after people listen to a bunch of murmur stories, the city is all fleshy and kind of human and a bit gross, maybe. Toronto never gets to play itself. Tons of movies are shot in Toronto because of its proximity to the US and the cheaper Canadian dollar. But Canadians are really excited when Torontonians are really excited when the city gets to be explicitly Toronto. The movie Chloe that just came out, Toronto plays Toronto, and everyone is a little awkwardly excited about that. It's interesting walking here. You walk by Canal Street, and I thought of the Queer as Folk, which took place explicitly in Manchester. They talked about Manchester, the way the Smiths sang about Manchester, all that sort of thing. The American Queer as Folk was shot in Toronto, but Toronto played Pittsburgh. Sometimes I walk outside of my front door and there'll be New York City cabs in front of my house because they're filming some New York show. And I'll think, where am I? So there's always this confusion, always just pulling us out of the local. We've since done it in other cities. This is us last September in Orange, New Jersey. When we go to other cities, we tend to do it in neighborhoods that are sort of the underdog neighborhood. We did it in Edinburgh 2 years ago, but we didn't do it on the Royal Mile. We did it in Leith, sort of the place just outside of the shiny center of cities. This is us in Orange. We work with local communities to get the stories. So these youth ran around their community and got the stories themselves. So we always try and partner with a local group. One thing we recently did with the Playwrights Guild of Canada was a version of Murmur called You Think, where we get youth to write site-specific plays. So they're kind of fictionalized version, old-time radio plays, and we have these different kind of signs that we put up around Toronto and about a dozen other cities in Canada. So that's Murmur. So 2 other quick things that I work on. One is about the same time started Murmur. I met up with these other friends who really liked Toronto, so we started a magazine about Toronto's public space called Spacing. And we put it out every 4 or 5 months, give or take. So it's quarterly. We have a theme each issue. Sometimes it was about the past plans of Toronto, talking about pedestrianism. So it's all the kind of new urbanism stuff you hear a lot about. We had an election issue in 2006, which is another election this year that we're going to do, water in the city. But putting out a magazine in Canada is really stupid because you will never make any money. It's such a small audience, especially one about a city. So what we stumbled upon, we have blogs too in other cities now, but we had this idea to make these buttons. Toronto has 69 subway stations on our OK subway system. It's not the tube in its extensiveness. But people look at each subway station as if it's their living room, and each subway station has very specific tiling. So we thought, let's make buttons, and we kind of, in Illustrator, faked the font of the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, and faked the tiles. So each one of these, DuPont Station has these kind of mod 1977 round buttons, round circles. High Park was made in the 60s, so it's a lot more clean and austere modernism. And we just started selling them on our website and the events that we throw for our magazine. And we've sold about 140,000 of these in the last 4 years. And these are pictures we found on Flickr. We didn't do this. People bought all the subways and laid them out in the shape of the map. This is the map of the Toronto subway system. So people sort of fell in love with this. And it really was great for us because it's kept our magazine afloat. It kept it in the break-even territory. So we could kind of pay our writers, underpay them, underpay ourselves. But it made the kind of content of the magazine possible. And we were just kind of really surprised at how attached people were to their subway station, to their public space. And yeah, this 140,000 of them, our button company is very happy with us. And last thing I'll talk about, I just wrote a book, which is out on Tuesday, called Stroll. I'm mostly a writer in Toronto. I write a column called Psychogeography, all about walking around the city. And I pick a different neighborhood each time, walk around it, talk about what it feels like, what was there, bits from the archive, and a little bit of psychogeography, psychogeographic fuzziness. And I've put them together in this book, and it's 32 walks around Toronto. And what I hope, just like with Murmur, I tell a lot of little stories, but physically attach all those stories in the walk, in these chapters. And in the same way Murmur, I hope, kind of attaches people to places, I hope this book helps too. My friend Marlena, she helped me illustrate it, so we have these nice maps that she did as well for the book, and so people can kind of follow along. And finally, this is the illustration of Toronto City Hall, and there's a fountain in the middle of City Hall. And I love this one because I think if Toronto is mythologized, the fountains in City Hall will spray neon purple water, sort of telling our stories. It's fun in my head when I say that. When I say it out loud, it sounds really lame, so I apologize for that. And that's it, I think.
Thank you, Shawn. That's great. My favorite story about the subway buttons actually is the mother who pinned the station button onto her kid so the kid would know where to get off, which I thought was adorable. I'd like to welcome Maarten Hajer to the stage, please. Sometimes I think I need a button to wear to tell me where to go. But anyway.
Thank you. Hi. I'm an urban planner and a political scientist, and since a couple of years I'm directing a research institute that deals both with urban planning and climate change. And for that reason, I'm trying to connect these two things to each other. And we were present in Copenhagen. Actually, we were doing a lot of the calculations for supporting the European Commission in their negotiations. But we all know Copenhagen failed. And we also know that about the time of the Copenhagen conference, there were people saying, well, that climate science actually is dodgy. And I think at the moment we sort of are in a situation where we don't know what's next. We don't know whether these states are ever going to come to an agreement. And we don't know what we should do. And I sense that there is a sort of a shift going on where there are other players that want to step into this space. And cities are among them, and firms and consumers. And the story I'm going to tell is a story about cool cities, where I'm sort of exploring the possibilities of cities becoming active in a very different way. And it's based on the idea, the conviction that there still is a real threat of climate change. There is no reason, scientific reason, to now suddenly think it's not true. And apart from that, there are these other planetary boundaries where we basically know we are not sustainable. But there are these things, as Shawn said, that are true, but are nevertheless not impressive. And that seems to be the case with a lot of environmental stuff. Nevertheless, we now have a World Expo in Shanghai, which are all about better cities and better life. So there is apparently a broad commitment that we need to recreate these cities. And in that expo, there is actually a Dutch pavilion, which I really like, not only because it's Dutch, not at all actually, but because somehow we seem to have succeeded in building something which is very different from the traditional expo pavilion, which is high-tech, showing new technologies. This is actually a walkway. It is a pedestrian walkway through all sort of spaces that the artist thought important. And interestingly, of course, because it was a walkway, they needed to do something with the ground level. And an artist was commissioned, and she said, well, if this pavilion is called Happy Street, then why not call this Happy Sheep? And they had a big argument with the people from the expo because they wanted to have a fencing off, because otherwise the sheep presumably would just walk away, right? Or of course, people would walk into their territory. But what nobody really realized is that all these families, Chinese families going there, wanted to be somewhere, and also be somewhere where there was shade. And so this whole Dutch pavilion now suddenly has become a place which shows public space is what matters, right? So public space, green spaces in cities are an important agenda, a completely unintentional statement that is really important now in the experience of the expo. Now, cool cities probably is not a very interesting phrase as such because it's misused so often. So for instance, there is Der Spiegel, the German weekly, that makes these lists. And it says, well, forget about London and Paris. The new cool cities of Europe are Amsterdam, Barcelona, Dublin, Copenhagen, Tallinn, Hamburg. And then there comes some sort of an argument. Now, what I find interesting is that these sort of things play such a role in city governments, then are worried that they sort of go down or go up on these lists. And there are, of course, plenty of these lists also in terms of economic performance. But But if you look at it from a sort of an analytical point of view, you can analyze which stories these cities prefer to tell. And then it becomes very disappointing because they're all telling the same Richard Florida creative city story, right? So collectively, we want to be unique by rediscovering our river, rediscovering our industrial heritage, setting money aside for artists, but then, of course, they are quickly gentrified out, and you get these sort of spaces. But no city from itself tells this story that the media tell, nevertheless, about cities. The stories about what goes wrong. And these stories, they don't need to be told by city governments. They are told through the web and through other types of media. And this woman, I think, is now texting what she actually sees while, carrying groceries. This is sort of the everydayness of Amsterdam at a moment that we don't want to remember. But you also get it, and that's again something that I can pick up on the previous speakers. It is something which Kevin Lynch coined, the phrase of the mental map of cities, that people have in their heads mental maps. And they're not only mental maps about positives, they're also mental maps about negatives. They are about the places to avoid. These were the riots in Paris. Or here are two maps of where people were shot in a school in Amsterdam. Or here is a recent map in Amsterdam of shooting incidents in a particular neighborhood. And they're then spread. So people have a constant, if you're an urbanite, you need to navigate yourself in a dangerous environment. As you know, cities are both a thrill and a threat. And of course, these maps then help you to sort of figure out where to move and where not to move. And so I suppose one thing you want to readjust, first of all, is to reconnect these positive cities, the stories told about the creative cities, and the stories not told, because otherwise it's just not going to be a sustainable city, right? So it's like in France's story. I mean, there is the derelict end to the creative city zone, and that if you don't connect that to it, it's not going to be a sustainable story. You're going to just waste a lot of money. Now, with climate change, I'm not going to go obviously into the science, but just imagine that what we are facing. If it is true, and again, there's no reason to doubt it, we need to go back 80 to 95% in our greenhouse gas emissions. And that's just a stunning task. And in terms of planning ahead, so in the urban area, if you think, how could we sort of still keep doing what we want to do in 2040, we need to think about how to, be mobile, and then think about the fact that we not only have cars, but obviously also have freight traffic, aviation, and ships. And if you then start to do calculations, which my agency then does, you see that all these fluids, all these biofuels, you need to use in aviation and ships or in freight. And basically, you have to now very quickly get to an all-electric regional transport system. I mean, how many cities are actually working on that? I mean, with 2030, you should have to have that basically sort of in order. It's a factor 12 in reductions that you want to be able to achieve. And these are sort of strategic planning tasks that should be discussed, but are not really. So climate change, I think, is something we might want to think about a bit more. We know basically a lot, but even in the situation where I'm working, we know these things, but that doesn't mean that the government necessarily knows them all. So we have to be imaginative about rethinking urban and regional transport. I mean, it's good to see a tram in Manchester, but it can only be a beginning, right? About housing stock, think about Victorian houses in Great Britain. I mean, you have, the energy goes into it as quickly as it goes out, the heat goes out. These need to be much more energy efficient. We know how to build housing energy neutral. We know basically what we can do to make traffic in a city much more climate neutral. And I suppose we also are aware that climate change doesn't mean that it gets very hot all the time. We get these heat waves. That's the most likely effect in summer. And obviously then you want to know how can cities then create sort of coolness in the literal sense so that we don't start to buy air conditioners to save ourselves individually, so to say. Now, this is a massive agenda, and I'm disappointed to see that it's so difficult to get that further, and states obviously are very reluctant, and in particular in a situation where there's so little money. But the true cool city would be one, I suppose, that combines this sort of environmental targets with these two that I previously mentioned, economic vitality and social resilience. But now, so this is then what our cities need, right? To be economically vital, socially resilient, and ecologically sustainable. Can we do that? And how? And I think not only about can we, but who should do this? Now here is a picture of a famous planner and architect. This is Cornelis van Eesteren, who probably you don't know, but he was the second man in the Congrès International de Architecture Moderne, the SIAM movement in the 1920s and 30s. And he made a famous layout, for instance, for the city of Amsterdam, which allows the green to come all the way into the city up till this very day. But what is interesting about this modern architect, this modern planner, is what he wears. He is wearing a white laboratory coat. And this was the modern planner in its symbolic expression. Why he would wear this laboratory coat was that a modern planner wanted to distance himself from the object, from the city, and from the citizens. So to really be analytically right and be scientific in his endeavor, he dressed up as in a laboratory coat. Now this face you all know. This is of course Corbusier, who looked literally down on cities in the way it's shown here, or this is his own pick for his book on the new city to replace the old, where you see the gesture that he thinks is appropriate to think about the good city is that one where the expert basically argues what needs to be done and then imposes that on the city. Now, that whole modernist dream, I suppose, went down in 1969 in St. Louis when the Pret Ego building was dynamited because it was completely unlivable. And after, of course, it had won an architectural prize first. But that whole modernist dream of the expert being in charge was first dynamited, and then I think we got a few decades of participatory planning where experts no longer dared to sort of say what they knew, but there were citizens at every single moment in planning speaking up, and of course becoming much more professional in arguing what they thought needed to be done, and also, in particularly very clever, in showing mistakes or assumptions in what the experts actually said. But where did that lead to? I suppose there is a sort of a need to reconnect, because it can't be the case that all that expertise, that knowledge that we need is now no longer sort of used. We need to reconnect and do that in a different way. Now, I think we have to do that in a very fundamental sort of way, and have to take into account a few new insights that come, say, from behavioral economics, or from neuropsychology, or in social science frame analysis. And that's one way in which you can explain that is by showing two people wearing helmets. Now, this is the classic case of a scooter driver wearing a helmet. Now, this person wears that helmet, of course, because there was a survey analysis, a statistical analysis, that showed that people not wearing helmets were likely to have brain damage, and therefore the state stepped in and ordered people driving scooters to wear helmets. And if you play that against this person who is here snowboarding, you see also a helmet-wearing person. But the interesting thing is about this person that not only wearing a helmet, is also wearing all sort of protective gear that is now hidden underneath the clothing, but they do. And they do that from their own free will. They do that from their own free will, and not only do they do it, but it seemed to be very cool to be protecting yourself. Now, I suppose that this type of image is one that might inspire people to rethink how can we face that threefold task of creating cool cities. What do we do wrong? Are we far too much in Model 1, where the state says, well, this is what needs to be done, therefore we order this? And what potential is there in thinking along what people want? Now, we can get a long way, actually, I think, with that. And there are a few words that you then have to take into account and become part of the new vocabulary. Now, the first one is the word default, and actually that again relates to what Francis said on Ramallah, I think, because the impressive pictures that he showed were pictures where you saw that the Israeli government knew very well, or it can't be Ramallah, but it must have been somewhere else, know very well that you can actually, in planning, reorder the city and then remake its culture. People who actually experience it might say, well, they are trying to do something to us, but the next generation will just live the city in a different way. They are changing the default. They are changing the things that are just simply there. And lots of behavior is actually default-led. People do not always make decisions. You do things because it is the default. So changing the default is actually a very, very powerful way of changing society. Now, there's big and small examples, and I give you two small examples because that is the easiest way to get the point. If you're in a hotel and you are environmentally friendly, the hotel says it's actually environmentally friendly, but you try and get to your room with the stairs, well, it's just not, you have to really make conscious decisions because the default is you use the elevator. Or, as you're all invited to dinners all the time, they ask, do you have any dietary wishes? And if the default is that you don't have dietary wishes and therefore you eat meat, right? So if you are a vegetarian, you say, yes, I'm a vegetarian. Actually, there's a box that says, yes, I'm a vegetarian, tick, right? But of course, the easiest way to, if we know that eating meat contributes to more than 1% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and we can actually collectively take more than 2% off if we would change our dietary wishes. It's a very complex story. You could say, well, the first thing the state should do, or any institution should do if it wants to be climate neutral, is change the default. So then the standard line under the invitation should be, do you have any dietary wishes? And there is this box that says, yes, I'm a carnivorian, right? I'm a carnivorian. So that the default becomes, I'm a vegetarian. Now, that is a way of thinking that comes actually out of the supermarkets, behavioral economics, and is related to nudge. It's a nicely popular book by Thaler and Cass Sunstein, Richard Taylor Cass Sunstein, that said, well, actually, it is the case that it's very difficult to get people out of bad eating habits, but then again, bad eating habits are always privileged. For instance, it's easy to grab certain goods in a supermarket rather than others, and there is a science to it. They know precisely which height you want to put out the goods that have most markup, and that's what they put out there. So you can actually redefine front and back like you can do that in a supermarket. You can also do that in a city. In the Netherlands, we have the cultural practice of Santa Claus, where you give presents to your kids, and it all comes with a chocolate bar. The chocolate bar is not sustainable because the people growing these beans get very low wages. In 1 week, consumer power in the Netherlands forced all the industries to now commit themselves to becoming sustainable by 2015. That is to say, to pay fair wages, to think about how these crops are grown so that they don't feed erosion and so forth, basically using consumer power. So multinationals are not only a big power force, they are actually very astute respondents to consumer power. And these sort of things can be used, and also media play a very key role in that. And then see citizens as producers. I mean, the idea that we can now produce our own electricity is a very interesting one. So recently in my neighborhood, we bought a wind farm, a part of a wind farm on the North Sea. And because it's obvious that I live in a neighborhood that has more spending power, we actually had another neighborhood next to ours, which is poorer, and they will also live off the sustainable energy we are going to produce with that wind farm. There is no intermediate there. There is no state. We are doing that on our own. And we can produce it. And if a state, of course, facilitates decentral production of sustainable energy like the Germans do, people become excited about the prospect of basically earning money in a green way. So here you have new words. Suddenly people want to be autonomous. Cities want to be autonomous because you see interdependence can also be risky. But cities can come up with their own ideas of how to be sustainable because that also enhances their autonomy. So London is now building this wind farm in the North Sea, which I think is an interesting experiment in that regard. Associations can also mean that you indeed as citizens together cooperate to finance these things like your own windmill. And you don't wait for central rule. That's the interesting thing. So we asked very quickly then 100 stakeholders what they wanted to do to become more climate neutral, and calculated all the things that needed to be done and where it would lead to. Now the brief story is that a city cannot become sustainable in its own territory. There is not enough space for PV and wind farms in the city. You have to think about where you get your energy from. And then, again, it becomes very interesting to hear what cities have to say when they want to be sustainable. And I think that the story is one where you talk about metabolism, that cities want to have a story where they get their resources from and how they act in a sustainable way. This is actually a Swedish city that is sustainable in that regard, has a story about its own metabolism. And the final sheet. I think that cool city is a possibility if people become excited about the possibilities of creating it themselves. It starts with thinking ahead, obviously, and I think that, I mean, if you look back, you see how quickly that can go. There is a culture where you no longer accept broken bottles. You actually go and bring them to the bottle bin. And you, well, in the Netherlands at least, you don't cope with diesel fumes in cities. You come to Britain, it's always, you think, God, I mean, how is it possible that you still have these trains with these fumes and cars with these diesel fumes? But they are phased out, nevertheless, right? And once that is done, people's culture and awareness changes. You can be a cool city if you take your responsibility for your own footprint also elsewhere. And you want to be seen then to be active on that, giving new meaning to that creative city idea. And I think actually having also a lot of advantages in the job labor market, because next generations are not going to just be uninterested about how well you are doing in that regard. You aim for changing defaults and aim for more autonomy by picking your own defaults. And you create, in that sense, then, your persuasive storytelling. And a government, this is really the final sheet, stops worrying about the wrong benchmark. What does it matter that Manchester goes down on the benchmark with Amsterdam if they don't compete? There is no, you always have to think about in which domains these cities compete. But you start to become interested in the right benchmarks. How well do we do on these three things? Social, cultural inclusion, economic vitality, and environmental sustainability. And one thing you want to really invest in is restore the cognitive and emotional relationship to what it requires to produce the good city life that we appreciate so much. Caroline Steele's book, Hungry Cities, I love, because it's an intellectual text that shows what it requires us to eat well and where that food all comes from. But that sort of text about the footprint is important also to spread out. Perhaps cities should have their own foreign policy about how they relate to elsewhere and also be accountable for it. You could envisage other associations with cities on other sides of the planet. You can privilege by changing defaults. You know, as a city, you can't do the job alone, and that's why you start to allow citizens to be producers, not consumers. And then becomes an interesting force. Perhaps these citizens have then a new sense of being active in a democracy because they take care for themselves, and citizen governments are then coordinating that by showing the ways in which different neighborhoods or different firms do well, explain why they do well, so that you allow them also to take over the best possible resolutions. That's the highlighting the urban successes as failures. You explain them, and that allows them to be sort of competitive in terms of creating a cool city, an interesting future that I hope to experience. Thank you very much.
And as we don't have any questions right off the top, though please feel free to jump in, I want to kick things off, I think, by saying that I like this notion that you mentioned, Maarten, of changing the default. And I think that's something that we don't often perhaps think about in terms of, we don't feel empowered to do so, perhaps, because the default is so completely ingrained in everything that we do, especially our daily lives as we navigate the cities that we live in. So how do we address the, I guess, underlying psychological problem of enabling people to feel like they can change those defaults? And that could apply to just about everything, I think, that you guys said in terms of culturally and also just in other ways of participating in the city.
We are actually have in CCA, we're getting classes on how to change people. for the same reason, because we're doing a lot of growing of vegetables, and we have a plot based on, again, Steele's book, A Hungry City. And the people we're working with are all interested in climate change, and they've been developing psychological ways to make us understand how people won't change, which they're teaching us so we can then try to change people when we're working with them. So it's very practical.
You're learning how to manipulate people.
Yeah. Well, learn to manipulate people so they'll change the defaults, so that, for instance, where we're working with people, you can't get vegetables, but to get them to sort of grow vegetables, to take control of the whole food distribution chain in Glasgow. So, but there needs to be a lot of change, both with the people in those areas, but also the people who will let that happen higher up in the authorities. And we're actually getting classes in it.
But according to Maarten, you should just do it. Don't ask people. Build your wind farms,
It's very disruptive city council. It's very interfering, so they keep stopping you. I think maybe you get away with more. They keep stopping us for reasons of health and safety, or things. Glasgow's not ready for it is one reason. The west of Scotland's not ready for it, they said. Famously.
Did they actually say that? Is that a quote?
Yeah. Actually, they said it very recently for something else, an exhibition about gay art. Gay artists wanted to make some work, and they said, no, the west of Scotland's not ready for this. But they said it about several other things as well, that actually, not ready for any of those things.
Wow.
That's what they said. So they're quite patriarchal.
But I would say, Shawn, as well, in your case, you didn't wait for anyone to give you you and your colleagues permission to create spacing, and now it's turned into quite an important way for people to express their views on what they would like Toronto to be. But do you think that that's expansive enough? Like, is it the same group controlling the interests? Because, of course, the people who are involved are the same editorial group, and you've grown and built this thing together. It's like your baby. How do you open that up as a platform for everyone?
Sell it in bigger stores, I guess. We always thought our audience at first was downtown, bike riding, Toronto, or super urban people. But we've slowly, over the 7 years we've been doing it, kind of spread out, and we get letters, and when we were at events, the soccer mom or the hockey mom in Canada, sort of person, the sort of semi-suburban, person who is not the traditional person who's into the stuff that we've talked about today is actually into it, because in spacing, what we try to do is bring these issues to somebody's sidewalk. And we are trying to, I mean, we have a point of view, and we do want to change people's way of living, get them on bikes, active transportation, get the streets designed differently. In North American streets, they're designed for big you said tanks in Ramallah, big Cadillacs in North America. There's an interesting connection.
Tanks, Cadillacs, same diff.
Yeah, because I want to drive that thing as fast as I can through a lot of space. We need to, radically change how we design, the infrastructure of these cities, and that's a challenge. So we try and bring it down to how that's going to affect somebody's kid playing on the sidewalk. Everybody wants, whether it's a suburban house or a downtown house, a nice place around their house, a nice public space.
That's true. Is there a question there? Yep, please approach the microphone.
Hello, Steve Smith from Urban Narrative. 3 fantastic presentations, thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question about scale, because it seems to me all 3 of the speakers talk about how cultural or artistic or environmental ideas become operational at the scale of the city. And I wonder what the role of the state is anymore, the nation state. It seems to me that you can have relevant discussions at the scale of Europe, you can have fantastic discussions at the level of the city, but what on earth is the nation state for as they sit on intermediate scale? I'd like your comments on that, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that nation states are actually the key agents to change these defaults. Because if you talk about climate change, there must be a target. So CO2 pricing is not something that states can, or that cities can do. So the incentives to really change things has to come from national states that commit themselves to long-term targets. That's I think where national states have a crucial role, and perhaps they can facilitate also a lot of learning in between cities. But the energy, the power to change things, I feel, is very much in firms and citizens and associations. That's where I hear constantly people saying, well, give us a long-term target so we can invest in a different sort of way. That's what multinational capital firms now actually say. They want to have clarity, long-term clarity. So, and that's something that only states and indeed it's a European Union or so can provide. But they are not, once they go into the instruments of how this should be happening, then they often make mistakes. So that's why you want to give them, you have the incentive structure right, and then cities can change accordingly.
I like that, because my answer would have been irrelevant, the nation state. And that's just based on Canada and Toronto in particular. We've had cities don't exist in the sort of national political arena. They're screwed around with. They're played against each other, rule versus city divides. And right now we have a conservative minority government. We've had it for 3 or 4 years. So this hung parliament thing is old hat for us. And it's your fault for giving us this system. But we're living with it badly. But cities are, the city of Toronto with its 2.5 million people, the 5th biggest municipality in North America under one government, is constantly having to go to the provincial government and the federal government asking for money for a subway, and this sort of thing. There's no direct connection to the nation state, so it's kind of aloof, and right now it's a jerk out there to the city. So it's a really weird relationship in Toronto anyway.
Yeah, I would agree that they're sort of almost useless in a sense, partly because politicians are so afraid to make any choice that might be seen to be controversial or disliked. So they kind of always make the compromise choice that's useless. So it's more local, and it's local pressure upwards that seems to be working more, or people dropping out entirely from economies that seems to be working rather than any sort of major nation state, because they're just terrified, as you saw in the last election here, to make any sort of promise to do anything that might be unfavorable or different. So they always sort of pander to the lowest common denominator of making everything, this is what you want, rather than saying, this isn't good for you, you're not getting it. So they haven't got the courage to do that, and they just never do it because they want power so much. So it has to come from below upwards, I think. And that's why I liked the sort of local sort of vision you were giving. That's becoming increasingly important, I think. So.
I guess it's obvious there's this huge tension, and that's what Maarten was saying about the targets. It can kind of work both ways. It becomes a sort of cudgel as well as a carrot. I guess it's one of those things that, anyway, cuts both ways.
Was actually in Shawn's presentation, he said there are things that are true but we don't care about or something. That's what you said, right? You remember that?
True or not true, it's out there.
Yeah, but might be that some of these things that you see as dystopias are so big that it paralyzes people because they, what can I do as an individual? I mean, this is, I'm clearly beyond. But there are also ways of dealing with information that can help people regain the capacity to change things. And in the previous session, the word tipping point fell all the time. And the theory of tipping points is that it's many individual decisions that then get a ball rolling. Now, what sort of information structure could help do that? Well, it's interesting, for instance, in the urban literature to see that there's a constant reference to examples of things that work, like Curitiba or Porto Alegre. There's 5 or 6 or 7 of these examples of miraculous changes in a city that worked, that became less corrupt, less criminal, more democratic, and less environmentally unsustainable. Well, that's a very primitive academic-led sort of discourse, but there are many other ways in which you could actually show that other people in precisely the same situation as you are doing things differently and are having a better life because of it. But that sort of state idea of that you constantly compare what's going on, what the possibilities are, what are the new sort of benchmarks are, is not in place. Because I think we're all waiting for the big states to agree in a Copenhagen meeting, then have a global treaty with a monitoring by the United Nations that then will disseminate and say what everything has to do. Well, that system might not be quick enough. It might actually be that other system is more productive, but then we lack sort of the information about that also allows people, and the incentive structures that allows people to then change their lives. So one final, two things actually. In Germany they have this feed-in tariff. That is also now a key example. It's a law, I think it fits on 10 pages. And it says if you, as a citizen or as a firm, produce sustainable energy, electricity, we will buy it back for a fixed rate. It led to an incredible surge in people installing PV systems and windmills. So far that they were worried about the money that it would cost. But they beat their targets. In the Netherlands, we have a wind farm in the north. And we were worried that the wind farm would produce electricity in the night when everybody's asleep. So they said, well, why not have a cable to Norway, electricity cable, so that if there is a lot of wind at night, we can then at least use it to pump up the water in the for hydroelectricity in Norway. It was a fancy idea, and everybody thought, well, it's very expensive, it's probably not going to work. In 1 year, it was already profitable. It was expected to be profitable in 5 years. So there is something about innovative capacities that often lead to an underestimation of the possibilities to change things. Well, these are the sort of things that you want to share much broader, and because then there becomes a pressure to install these systems. So the German story is such a success story that you see that other parties in other countries now say, we want feed-in tariffs. And actually the guy who drafted this law has now a sort of a firm that translates basically that law so that all these other countries can more easily adopt that very same system. So the learning capacity can be enhanced, and then I think people might become active again.
Ontario just put in a feed-in tariff last year, and already all these little companies are sprouting up in Toronto, selling small-scaled, sustainable technologies. But I think to get people, it comes down to like people are, I think, scared of this idea of change and how is the climate change and whatever else that's going to affect my life. And if we can, and it becomes kind of political, and a deft political hand is needed to communicate to people that the change that's going to come one way or the other doesn't have to be too radical. Your life will more or less be the same. Right now it's an election season in Toronto, a municipal election, and it's really actually completely depressing right now because the smallest things are being used as these wedge issues. Bike lanes being put in are used as fear tactics of downtowners versus suburbanites who drive around. So innocuous little bike lanes that aren't going to affect anybody are now being used as it's being called the war on the car. Wind farms, which are proposed in Lake Ontario, outside of, just off the shore of Toronto, there's a big kind of faction of political candidates who are vehemently against these things. Not in my backyard. It's going to ruin the skyline. It's an unproven technology, and the rhetoric is getting so cranked up that it's just depressing. So, and some of the people who have been running the bike lane campaigns and some of the wind farm campaigns haven't been doing that good of a job at chilling people out when they deliver the message and kind of saying how it's going to affect your life in a kind of easy way rather than it's going to ruin my life. Communications.
That's what I would have thought about Glasgow, in that it's actually quite a deadening space in the centre, and it also involves not seeing a whole periphery, which is people who are completely in debt, as you're saying. So there's a sort of deafness to the whole thing. I think also there's too much emphasis on growth. Growth is the sort of dream. Everyone's living the dream of growth. And all the government's talking about, we'll soon be back to growth, which is like we'll soon be back on heroin, really. It's, growth is kind of the major problem behind all of this dream of constant growth. And where are we all growing to? But there could be a different kind of mental shift or a different default where growth stops being the sort of the ultimate thing.
And on that note, I don't want to grow this panel beyond its allotted lifespan. So it's time for lunch. Let's give a warm thank you to our speakers.